So it's been my pleasure to introduce Craig a number of times, and I remember the first time I introduced Craig. It was only about the third meetup that we'd run, and I'd read this. There was this body and Larman, and there was kind of mystical figures. And being the third meetup I'd ever introduced, I was a little bit nervous. So introducing Craig the first time was a bit apprehensive, and I was sort of like, "Here's Craig Larman." But then the second time, I'd been on a course with Craig, and I'd got to know him, and we'd spent a bit of time talking about things. I was very pleased to say that the second time I introduced Craig, I could introduce him as a friend. And then the time rolls on, as it does, and I introduced Craig again for the third time, and this time with a causal loop diagram to explain why Craig is so cool. So this is the fourth time, I think, and so I thought, well, what can I do? Well, how can I introduce him again? So I thought, what better way to introduce Craig Larman than with a Zen story? So you may have heard various versions of this Zen story, and a Zen story always has some kind of other meaning, some kind of metaphor to it. So this story starts off with a very wise sage. It's the sort of person that people come to see for advice. People travel all over the land to come to see this wise sage. It doesn't turn anyone away. And one day, he's sitting there in his wise, sage-ish place, and a very command and control type chap comes up, and he sits down, and the sage, he says, how can I help? And in his commanding and controlling voice, the businessman demands that the sage show him the path to enlightenment. Please show me this path. And the sage looks at him and he says, not before tea. And so they go and they sit together to have tea. And the sage pulls out his AWA mug. And he says, here's your tea. The cup is empty. And so the sage starts pouring the tea. I'm sure you've heard this before. And the tea fills up and up until it reaches the brim of the cup. And he keeps on pouring until the tea spills all over the table and all over the businessman's £5,000 suit. At this point, the businessman jumps up and he says, stop, enough. Why are you pouring? It's obviously full. And the sage says, you must empty yourself first before you can take on any more. So with that, I would like to present Craig Larman, an empty mug of the Craig's special AWA speaker mug. So that you can pour tea, hopefully without it spilling everywhere.
Thank you
very much, Craig.
Can I talk? I can talk about this. So my stories are a bit different in tone. So there's a guy walking through the Scottish countryside, and he comes across this beautifully crafted stone wall. And he's walking along and admiring it, and then he sees this guy leaning by the wall. And the other guy says to this hiker, welcome, he says. I can't do Scottish accents, but imagine it was Scottish. Welcome. And the hiker says, I was just walking along and admiring this extraordinarily well-crafted stone wall. And the other guy says, I made this wall with my own hands. I'm the builder of this wall. The hiker says, wow, this is amazing work. I'm really impressed. And the other guy says, my name is Hamish, and I built this wall. And then he says, but you think they call me Hamish the wall builder? Nay. And then Hamish says to the hiker, and you see that house over there, that beautiful house? And the hiker looks at it and goes, oh yeah, it's a beautiful house. I really like the design and everything. Good workmanship. And Hamish says, yeah, well, I made that house with my own hands and designed it too. And the hiker says, good on you, that's a great job. And Hamish says, yeah, but you think they call me Hamish the house builder? Nay. Oh. And then Hamish points over to the water, the ocean, and sees it. You see that wharf there, that beautifully designed wharf? Yeah. I built that with my own hands. Impressive. But you think they call me Hamish the wharf builder? Ah, nay. But you fuck one sheep. Yeah, it's downhill from there. I'm going to share some thoughts from this slide presentation. It'd be a lot more fun if we had a guitar. Those big speakers are just calling out for distortion. And so I'm going to share a bit of a presentation, formally, do some sketching with some comments, and spend around half of our hour and a half together doing that, and then spend the other 45 minutes in a structured Q&A session with you. We'll start off with this structured stuff. This is called Less, 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 this presentation. First of all, resources. You can learn more about LeSS at less.works. Hashtag LeSSworks. We're not doing a book raffle tonight. Normally I like to do a book raffle at these of our latest third book, but the books didn't show up. Let's talk about scaling. I'd like to start with a caution. This is the first large software-intensive product ever created in the world. It's called the SAGE system, late 50s through to early 60s. And it was anticipated to require a relatively small number of developers and effort, and it ended up requiring a lot of developers and a lot of effort. And when it was all over, one of the directors was asked, if you have to do it all over again, what would you do different? And he replied, find the 10 best people and write the entire thing themselves. And I think that there's a real lesson to take from this story, the first large-scale development that's applicable today. My friend and colleague, Bas Voda, the co-creator of LeSS, and we've been spending decades working on large multi-site and offshore development. And if you could boil down our key advice over all of these years, here's what it kind of boils down to. Don't, and don't. The reasons why people think that you need a lot of people to make a product are often based upon a misapprehension of the system and the nature of the workers. For example, that the nature of the work is linear, like twice as many requirements, twice as much effort. If you're familiar with Barry Bame's Kokomo 2 research, though, for example, the research shows that the relationship between effort and between the size of the requirements and effort is superlinear, which is really kind of surprising. But not if you're a computer scientist. My training is as a computer scientist, because typically the amount of coupling and complexity in software increases superlinearly with the number of lines of code, so in a way that's not surprising. And so, you know, the hole is twice as big, we need twice as many ditch diggers. That kind of mentality that this is a ditch digger problem. And also another aspect of misapprehending the nature of the system, I love a famous quote by Kent Beck, who said one of the founders of the Agile movement and creator of XP, and I think arguably the most influential and important person ever in software development. Many people don't know that he's the founder of the whole field of patterns as well. Kent once said that software development is a learning activity with code as a side effect. And I think that's a really insightful way of describing what's going on. Programming, coding, and both Bus and I work as professional programmers. I'm not primarily a teacher, I'm a paid programmer. So we come at this from the point of really understanding the nature of the work. And indeed, it is primarily a knowledge creation or a knowledge discovery activity. I remember some years ago being involved in a LeSS adoption at a bank where there was a meeting going on, and one of the business side managers complained to the programmers, "We don't pay you to learn here." And I love the irony of this because the 4 values of the company, number 1 was, we're a learning organization. But groups still scale. Some of the reasons are compelling. For example, right now I'm working at BMW in Munich on the self-driving car. I'll be there probably for a couple of years. And they're doing both a LeSS adoption, so I'm working on debugging the organizational design, and I'm working on the code. I do a lot of embedded, if you know what I mean by embedded C, TDD, mob programming coaching, I do a lot of that. So I'm working like sort of debugging the software and debugging the organizational design. And it's 700 people for both the software and the hardware, and I get that it would be hard to build that new car with just 7 people. You might need 10 or 14. But a lot of the reasons are questionable, and that my opening point is really about really questioning the underlying premise of scaling. So is LeSS for scaling? And at this point, I'd like to apologize and admit false advertising, because LeSS is not for scaling. And if you've come here to learn about scaling, you're probably going to be very disappointed. People sometimes ask me, what's a good framework for scaling? And I don't know. And I don't think that's a very interesting question. So LeSS is for descaling. It's not for scaling, it's for descaling. How can we apply Agile at scale in our big, complex organization? I've heard this question before. Maybe you've heard this question. And I'd like to suggest that maybe this is not the right question. Instead of asking, how can we smear Agile paste on top of our apparently complicated large organization and do Agile, we could ask a different question. Traditional large groups are complicated, though not because they need to be, but because their organizational designs create an illusion of necessary complexity. And I visit one of these groups where there's, let's say, 300 people in a single product group, and because of the organizational design, there's large amounts of coordination needed, and you need coordination managers and coordination plans, And it all seems terribly complicated. And so then the question is posed, how do we put something on top of this and then say that we're doing Agile? Rather than asking a very different question, which is, why is the organization like this? And could we radically simplify the organization and be Agile rather than do Agile? Have the quality of the system that expresses adaptiveness, the ability to turn on a dime for a dime, the ability to change direction with no cost. How can we simplify the unnecessarily big and complex organizational design? That's a different question. And this is the question that Bas and I are exploring with the world of people interested in LeSS. And that's why it's called LeSS. LeSS is about deleting and simplifying. It's not about adding. And so what LeSS is about is descaling the organizational complexity. And to offer a throwaway comment that I won't unpack right now, that organizational complexity is based upon a cognitive bias, a Homo sapien, plains of Africa, evolutionary cognitive bias called local optimization. And out of this local optimization cognitive bias arises organizational design elements, from single specialist roles and teams to policies and processes, which express this local optimization cognitive bias, which permeates large organizations overarchingly and just repeating everywhere. It's like herpes. It just infects the organizations. And we're saying, instead of, what cream do you put on your lips to how to deal with herpes? How can we eliminate herpes? And that's why the catchphrase of LeSS is called More with Less, because it's about simplifying the organization. Learning resources? Well, you can learn from people like me and Simon and other people who help people learn about LeSS. There's our third LeSS book, which is a good place to start. It's a primer and a summary. There's our first two LeSS books, which we wrote 10 years ago. As you may or may not know, LeSS is a very old system. It's not something new. And the first LeSS book is probably the second book to read. And then the second LeSS book on large multi-site offshore product development. You can learn some things about scaling from my old Agile and Iterative book, which I wrote a long time ago. And you can also learn from LeSS.works. Okay. That's all I wanted to do by way of slide-based introduction. Now what I'd like to do is look at one of the myriad organizational design elements and kind of deconstruct it from this point of view of simplification. And to be clear, LeSS has nothing to do with Agile coaching. I'm not an Agile coach. I've got no interest in this subject. This is not about methodology or Agile methods or anything like that. I'm an organizational design consultant, and this is about organizational design. When you're speaking about large-scale organizational systems, and I'll occasionally talk about systems because I come very strongly from a systems thinking background. when you're talking about large-scale organizational systems, practices, methods, how much love there is in the room is all essentially meaningless. It's all second-order or third-order tertiary effects. When you're talking about 700 people in 7 different sites, and it's the business analysts, 100 of them in Site 1, and 100 architects in Site 2, and the UX designers in Site 3, and the front-end programmers in Site 4, and the testers in Site 7. What you do in terms of practices, methods, ways of working, improving the psychological and social health locally is utterly meaningless. It's all second or third order factors. The first order factor in large scale is structure. And unless you get rid of that 700 person, 7 city structure, everything you do is just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So Les and my discussions will have virtually nothing to do with practices and techniques which are meaningless at the large scales that Bus and I work with. So you'll notice it'll be focusing on structure. Now, one of the structural elements that you often see in place in organizations based upon local optimization cognitive bias are called component teams. And to define term, these will represent software components, chunks of code, front end, back end, middle tier, pricing engine, and on and on. So if you're not familiar with the term a component team, if you have chunks of code with programmers associated with them, if you've ever heard of, for example, the front end programmers, etc., that's a component team. So let's imagine these are the 9 components that make up the architecture of the product. And we attach humans to these components, programmers. And we say, you work on just that code and that component. You're a JavaScript programmer, you do the front end. And so then not only do we have components, but we have component teams. So what? Let's look at the implications of this. And I'm going to start with, as an example, a customer feature. Let's call it F1. And it's quite likely that the following is true. In the simplest case, a real customer feature spans front end or back end. But in larger systems, it might span multiple components. And right away, we see one of the implications of this, which is that the work of F1 is going to have to be decomposed into 3 tasks for these 3 component teams. So there's a decomposition activity. That's one implication. But it's more rich than that. For example, F2. And now we see a second implication of this, which is that we have competition for this component team's time. And, well, so far it doesn't look like that difficult, but this is not the real situation of the organizational system. It's more like this. And so on. So now we see that the coordination and prioritization problem is more complicated. So that's one of the implications. But let's look at another. Let's look at the story of F1 from soup to nuts, from beginning to end. When F1 first comes into the company, the first question is about analysis. what does it mean? And there's both, let's call it functional analysis, user experience analysis, and so forth. Let me just lump that together and simplify it and just call it analysis. Now, a rhetorical question. Who's going to do the analysis? Will it be the Angular JS JavaScript developers? Will it be the Java pricing engine developers? Will it be the database Oracle developers? It's not clear. In fact, you might not know even which components are going to be touched, and so then you have a chicken and egg problem. And secondly, people pose the question, well, why would we have the database developers do the business analysis? That doesn't seem to make sense, and that wouldn't seem to be efficient because they're the database developers. And so, as a rhetorical question, then who does it? And the answer is, oh, I know. We need a separate group. And let's give them a name. The analysts, the business analysts, the UX analysts, or whatever. Now, rhetorical question, how likely is it that they will discover everything and then simply communicate their discovery to all of these teams verbally by talking? I suppose it's possible, but it's kind of unlikely. Therefore, they probably create some kind of a document. And before we go any further, I want you to notice that the apparent need for this group and this artifact and now this process step is a consequence of the original constraint of saying there are component teams. If we start with this as a constraint based upon local optimization cognitive bias, it gives birth to the apparent need for this role. Carrying on. Another question is, what components are touched by F1? And even once we know the answer to that, who's going to do the end-to-end design across the components? And who's going to do, for example, the design of the interfaces? Well, the first question is a kind of a chicken and egg question, because the question is, what components are involved? Which component team would we ask to solve that problem? That's not clear. Would you ask the Oracle database PL SQL programmers? Would you ask the Angular JS programmers? That's not clear. And it also doesn't seem to make sense because they're the Oracle PL SQL programmers. Why would we ask them to answer that question? Furthermore, when you have component teams, they're often associated in different cities. Beijing, Bengaluru, Boston. And so then assigning them this task is further complicated. So we introduce another role. What role do we call that? We need an architecture role. And so we introduce another role, the architecture role, or in some companies this is called a system engineer. And they take this, and they probably produce that. And I want you to notice yet again that the apparent need for this role and this artifact, and now this growing process, is a side effect of having originally established the constraint that there are component teams. That has given birth to this. Notice also, by the way, that this is turning into a sequential life cycle. Component teams give birth to sequential life cycles. Component teams beget sequentiality. let's go a bit farther. Now let's introduce the identified component teams who do their task. Rhetorical question, can we give to this component team these two artifacts? Maybe, and if it's a little tiny large group, like 3 or 4 teams, they probably know everything so well that they could just read these and extract their component task from that. In large scale, which is normally my world, it's complicated enough that that's not so straightforward. And then we introduce another role in between. And I've seen many names for this role over the years. The one that seems to fit best is called technical business analyst. And they take these artifacts and they are usually know a lot about this technical component, and so they can figure out how to extract the salient information for that component. And then they create another artifact for this team. Now, this is interesting. If you ask this team, this component team, what's that? You know what they'll answer? Oh, that's a customer requirement. So they've lost the plot. Now, the next step of the diagram, I could, in theory, draw as follows. We have code, and the code is being created. But I shan't. So I'm not going to do that, and I'll explain why. Why am I going to erase this? Because this suggests that the code is coming together. But that's a misrepresentation. Why? Because, for example, this is not what's going on in the organizational system. This is what's going on. And so a better description is that in each of these groups, there are queues with work packages in front of them. There's multiple artifacts, queues, multiple artifacts, and multiple artifacts. That's not a very good one. And here's the key point. It's not the case that every one of these work packages takes exactly 17.5 person hours to move on to the next step. We're not talking like handling IP packets in a router here. There's variability. Some of these work packages are 17 person days, some of them are 23 person hours. And so, here's the key point, the work starts to get done asynchronously. So that if we look at June 1 for these 3 teams and we ask the question, is it the case that on June 1 all of these 3 teams are working on their part of F1? The answer is no, because of the asynchronous nature of what's going on, because not everything is exactly the same size. That's one reason. And the second reason is this, because there's competition for this team's time, and someone's going to yell and say, no, me first. And so the work packages start to get done out of order because of that as well. And so for both of these reasons, on June 1, this team could be working on their part of F1. They could be working on their part of F3. They could be working on their part of F5. Years ago when I was working in Hangzhou, China, where Bus lived, Bus speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese and has lived in China for a long time in development. We worked with a group where when they were in this component team model, the asynchrony with respect to F1, 11 months for their part of F1s, but it makes the point. So this visualization suggests all the code is coming together, but that's not how it is, because if the work is being done asynchronously and because per definition, F1 involves interaction between these components. So this team here writes some code that makes a call on this component, but on 10 a.m. on Monday morning when they write the code to make the call, if this component doesn't have the service provider for that call, they can't integrate the code. Otherwise it would break. So we don't have continuous integration, we have delayed integration. And so a better representation of what's going on is this, that the code is separated until some point in the future. Now, at some point in the future, the code's got to all come together. Which of these 9 component teams will take on the task of integrating all the code, of putting it on trucks and sending that code in the trucks to the integration factory and then mushing it all together? It's not clear which of those 9 teams would do that movement. So let's introduce another group. Let's just call them integration workers, who do the act of integration. Now, they do the task of essentially making this happen. But this picture also misrepresents the situation. I work as a hands-on developer. Maybe we've got some hands-on developers in the room. So those of you who are in the room who are hands-on developers, if there's been a delay between this and this, does this just go smoothly? No. And therefore, there's problems, and therefore, there's an interruption back to the component team to handle this interruption. So not only do we have this going on with the team, but you have this interruption from that dynamic as well. But finally, that's happened. And now it's time to do the end-to-end system testing for F1. Which of these 3 teams will do the end-to-end system testing? It's not clear. What do we need? We need a system testing team. And perhaps at this point you can see that the need for this team is a side effect, is a side effect of originally starting with component teams. With this as a constraint, that has given birth to this organizational design. And, okay, they do the end-to-end testing. Does that just go smoothly without problems? Probably not. And so there'll be more interruption back into the teams. And so we have another source of multitasking and interruption as well. Now, because F1 has been chopped up across so many different teams, it's possible to lose track of it. And there's so much going on with so many work packages that have been chopped up. There's a lot of tracking in order to not lose track of this. There's a lot of coordination needed. So who's going to solve that problem? We need project managers, or perhaps more correctly called feature managers. They're really coordination managers and tracking managers. And I hope you can see that the entire need for this is a self-inflicted wound from the artificial complexity created by this situation. Okay, now, I want to, I guess I'm going to have to erase this one now. So, let me branch for a moment and talk about system optimizing goals. An organization can be optimized, the organizational system can be optimized for different things. For example, low end-to-end cycle time, delivering high value, having high adaptiveness, which means that you can turn on a dime for a dime, low cost of change. This is what agility means. Agility doesn't mean those things. Agility means cheap change. Secrecy, busyness. And there's many things you can optimize a system for. There's not one platonic truth of what's the correct thing to optimize a system for. But let's examine this organizational design with respect to some of these different optimizing goals. First of all, by the way, sometimes when I'm invited into these kinds of organizations and I ask the senior management, so what is your system optimizing goals? They'll say, well, Craig, we're optimized for low cycle time, high value, and adaptiveness. Agility. Okay, let's analyze this logically. Let's start with low cycle time. Just stepping back, does this look like a low cycle time organizational design? If you understand queuing theory, you know that you can see that you've got many queues in here, and there's also variability. And it's a fact of queuing theory that in a system with multiple queues in the presence of variability, the average cycle time increases superlinearly with each additional queue. So this is hellacious from the point of view of understanding cycle time and queuing theory. Or if we flip from mathematical analysis to empirical research, if you study, for example, IEEE transactions, you'll know that software engineering research correlates this model with the most schedule overruns of any model. So both sort of by an informal, naive common sense, you have a sense this is not a low cycle time model. Queuing theory shows this, and empirical software engineering research shows this. So, contrary to claim, it's not associated with low cycle time. How about adaptiveness or agility, meaning the ability to turn on a dime for a dime so that you can change direction in unanticipated ways at zero or almost no cost, so you can just keep changing direction based upon learning? Do you think that you can just turn on a dime for a dime with that system? Hardly. There's a huge amount of whip in here, and if we were to just say shut everything down, first of all, the shutdown costs are non-trivial, and then if we pour new things in the front end and turn the crank, you can imagine it's going to take a while before it fills back up again. So it's absolutely inconsistent with agility, which means low cost of change based in unanticipated directions. How about value? The managers said to me, hey, we're optimized for high value. Well, maybe. Let's look at this one a little bit more carefully. Imagine we have a list of requirements, and imagine this list of requirements is sorted by value. Just imagine that were possible. Because we're talking about a large scale, multiple components and component teams, we can ask and answer the question, what components are touched by each requirement? For example, if you analyze the first requirement, you could discover it touches those three components. And that's for number 30. Now, let's run a thought experiment. Suppose that if people actually worked this way, and estimation was done to have some idea of when we'd get to number 30, imagine it was estimated that it would take 6 months before we get to requirement number 30 in the value list. Secondly, in this thought experiment, assume that this is the first requirement that touches component C13. Now, imagine it's 2 days into this story, not 6 months, and the CEO comes to the development site, and she goes to the room where the C13 programmers ostensibly are, and she opens the door, and there's nobody there. And she goes and finds the C13 component team manager, and she asks the manager, hey, where's the 5 C13 programmers? And he says, oh, well, we've estimated that it's going to be 6 months before it's time for them to do their task on their component. So I've invited them to go windsurfing in Hawaii for the next 6 months, because there's nothing for them to do yet. So does she say, yeah, that's a good idea? Or does she say, no, they have to be, what do they have to be? Busy. What, I mean, realistically, what does she say? The second, right? I'm not making this up. So, on the first day of this putative system, what requirement does the C13 team work on? What number do they work on? Number 30. So at the beginning of this organization, people are working on low-value items. In other words, it's not true that it's organized working on high value. It's actually optimized for what goal is it actually optimized for? It's optimized for busyness, which has got nothing to do with low cycle time value or adaptiveness. Now, okay, that's a sad situation. But fortunately, this group, the senior managers, they go to a course and they learn about scaling Agile. And they come back and they have a radical new insight of how to organize so that they can scale Agile. And after they come back, here's the new organizational design that fixes their problems since they've been to the Scaling Agile course. So now they have product owners who are writing epics, and there's Agile architects who are writing architectural epics, and we have team product owners who are writing stories, and we have Scrum teams, and oh, this is DevOps. And here's the Agile system testers, and they're definitely working on stories because that's a fiction. And who are these people? Oh, these are the Agile coaches or the Scrum Masters. And now we've radically improved the system. Has anyone here ever seen something like this? So I'd like to suggest that this is not skillful. This is just what I call change theater. It's not addressing the structure. It's not addressing the first order factors that influence the organizational system's behavior. And what it actually illustrates is Larman's laws of organizational behavior. And I'm going to want to come back to the slides now if I can. When you get to be really old like me, you get to name some management laws after yourself. Why is there so much lean butt, Scrum butt, Kanban butt, DevOps butt? You know, like, for example, you might not believe this. I visited a group that said, oh, we have a DevOps group. I mean, how insane is this? I'm sure you've read, the writings from the people who made up the name DevOps, Patrick Dubois, Jez Humble, and the post that they've written called "There's No Such Thing as a DevOps Group," by the people who made the name and introduced the idea. Because the idea of DevOps means the elimination of a separate group and the developers do the operations task. How did that get mutated into the complete distorted opposite of a separate group? Even when the authors of the idea have written a post called "There's No Such Thing as a DevOps Group." How do you get this bullshit change all the time? How do you get this fake change and change theater all the time? And I think after 40 years of working in this world, I've kind of boiled it down to Larman's laws. Number one, there's 5 of them. Number one, organizations are implicitly optimized to avoid changing the status quo, middle and first level manager and specialist positions and power structures. It's an implicit optimization because if I were, for example, to go to the front of the Ticketmaster building and find your corporate values, you're not going to find a plaque on the wall that says, "We're optimized to maintain the status quo." Number 2, as a corollary to 1, any change initiative will be reduced to overloading or redefining the new terminology to mean basically the same as status quo. Does this sound familiar? Number 3, as a corollary to 1, any change initiative will be derided as purist, theoretical, religious, needing pragmatic customization for local concerns, which deflects from addressing the weaknesses and the manager's specialist status quo. This is an especially neat trick which you might have been blindsided by. So essentially, the specialists, the self-serving behavior of the managers and specialists are saying, well, okay, I understand that the real implications of the change mean that my position should go away. But that wouldn't be pragmatic. We don't want that kind of religious change idea. We need to make it pragmatic, which means anything that would mean that my self-serving desire to remain in my manager position has to remain the same, and so we'll change the change rather than me letting go my claws into my position. Number 4, as a corollary to 1, if after changing the change, some managers and specialists are still displaced because they couldn't quite fully deflect the change, they become the coaches and trainers for the change, frequently reinforcing number 2 and number 3. And number 5, culture follows structure. The first 4 are observational, and the 5th is operational. What do I mean by number 5? You can't change culture. And I can quickly spot a person who's kind of young and innocent in their first change fad. If they ever write or say, "This is a culture change," basically on top of their head is a big light flashing, "I'm really new to this stuff." You can't change culture. Truly naive. And let's explore some examples that illustrate this. Suppose we work in a company with single specialist job titles: business analyst, architect, programmer. And they even have a career path, BA1 to BA2, with more money. And there's an appraisal system where once or twice a year, you're appraised to see if you can go from BA1 to BA2 and so forth. That's part of structure, part of the organizational design. Now, in that context, somebody comes along to the BAs, to the architects, and says to them, hey, I got an idea. Why don't you avoid doing BA work, avoid doing architecture work, and why don't you architects focus on learning video creation for the next couple of years? Hey, you BAs, why don't you focus on learning JavaScript? So, hey everybody, it's a culture change. And then you observe what happens, and unless you're a fantasist, you're going to observe very little changing. Why? Because everything about the organizational design and the incentives, the structure is rewarding and communicating the behavior of be a BA. Yeah, you might get some little minor temporary changes, but the system is strong. The system is first order. In other words, behavior, mindset, follow system. And the operational implication of this is that you gotta change structure before you can change culture. For example, like at JP Morgan, when we did a LeSS adoption there, before the adoption, we introduced a new job category called product developer, a very broad category. And to go from the levels product developer 1 to 2, and from 2 to 3, having to become deeply skilled in 3 skills, deeply skilled in 7 skills. And then all of the people change to that job category with the new career path incentives and messaging. And that won't magically make everyone want to become multi-learning and multi-skilled, but it's a necessary but not sufficient precondition. Because culture follows structure, and until you fix structure, you're not going to fix it. Or another example, you have programs and projects in place, and programs and project managers. Even better, the project and program managers are on a career path to becoming more senior ones. Even better, they get an appraisal, and the appraisal is related to, are your projects and programs successful? Apparently. So go into that organization and then say to the program and project managers, hey everybody, let's be completely transparent and tell everyone how fucked up everything really is. It's a culture change. You're a fantasist if you're in that naive world of young change agents. Until you get rid of the whole concept of projects and programs and project managers and their career paths and so forth, you're never going to get transparency. It's a fantasy. Culture follows structure, which is why you have to start with structure changes. So that's all I wanted to share by way of preface. I think there might be a bit of wrap-up, just information at the end. Let me see if there's anything I want to close with before we shift to Q&A. Oh yeah, someone even made a website, larmanslaws.org. I didn't make that, but if you ever want to know. And as a reminder, there's LeSS.works where you can learn more about LeSS. And there's the LeSSworks hashtag. Okie dokie. Let me check my time. We'll end at 8:15, is that right? So we have about half an hour. Now, what we're going to do in this structured Q&A is the following. I'd like y'all to get together in pairs. For example, you two folks to get together, you two folks to get together. And I'm going to set the timer for 3 minutes. And in your 3-minute conversation with your colleague, discuss generating questions for me. I've learned over the years it works better when you can actually discuss this with someone. And then in 3 minutes, we're going to come back together. And the goal is to generate questions for me. See you in 3 minutes. Now, in each pair, I'm going to assign to one of the two people in each pair awesome and godlike powers. One of you two becomes the question holder. So figure out who's the question holder in each pair. All right, next step. Is there a question holder in the room that was born in the month of January? February. Please, sir.
So we were sort of interested in the time frame and process from converting from component teams to feature teams. How long it usually takes, what is the kind of work involved in doing that, and what's the, I suppose, the expected reduction in throughput of the teams whilst in that transition?
So it takes at least 1 hour, sometimes 2. No, I'm not joking. I mean it quite seriously. I'll give you the resources for how it's done. Oops, I don't want that. And forming teams in LeSS. So at the Scrum Alliance years ago, I wrote an article on how we do this in LeSS. There we go. And so the way that you form feature teams from, by the way, not just component teams, when you do a LeSS adoption, every group is eliminated. The architecture group is eliminated, the analysis group is eliminated, the UX group is eliminated, the testing group is eliminated. In a LeSS adoption, there are no specialist groups. I want to make sure that's clear. There's no architecture group, there's no UI design group. Every group is dissolved, every one. And there's only feature teams. And how this is done is that all 50 people get together in a room, and then there's an activity called the Self-Designing Team Workshop, and it usually takes about an hour for the people in the old model to reform into feature teams. So it's about 1 to 2 hours. But I think you had another question as well. Oh, the throughput question. Yeah. If that's a question, then don't even try to do meaningful change. If there's so little slack in the system and so little insight by the so-called senior management that they don't understand that this is a multi-year, heck, a 10 or 20-year constancy of purpose initiative, you're just wasting your time. You're familiar with Dr. Deming? So Dr. Deming, one of the most famous management guru of the 1980s, his famous 14 points for managers. Point number 4, I think, is called constancy of purpose. So managers need to, if they're going to do this, they're going to think, okay, we're going to do a LeSS adoption, 10 to 20 years, and we're going to have constancy of purpose over the next 10 or 20 years for this. So if the organization is so dysfunctional that they're worrying about such things, don't even start. It's just a waste of time. You're working with just people playing change theater. You're working with probably managers who are doing the change theater game. As you may or may not know this. So you, for example, might be in some organization where you find some so-called executive champion who appears to be really behind the agile adoption. Oh, we have our executive champion. How wonderful. They really care about us. You don't know that this person understands to claw their way up the corporate career path. One of the boxes they have to check is, I have apparently led a successful change initiative. or they're planning to hop companies and this will look really great. And so what's really going on is change theater and lots of noise and storm and so forth, but they don't really have any sense of the constancy of purpose, the testicular fortitude that's going to be required for the next, say, 10 years to actually make the deep change that's implied. And in those cases, you shouldn't even try to introduce meaningful change. Okay. That's February. Another February baby. Yes, hi.
Could I just interrupt, sorry? We have a microphone as well for the camera.
Okay. Yeah, because it'll be picked up on the camera then.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll start by saying that I'm the chair of the Change Management Institute. I kind of get what you're saying. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, so become vegetarian. Can you give a little bit of example of outside of the self-organising teams, what have you seen that organisations need to do to turn vegetarian? Is it a boardroom conversation? What level of persuasion do you have to get to allow the self-designing teams piece to be okayed?
Right. I get this question can be summarized as how do you convince management, blah, blah, blah. And I get this question a lot from people who are in their first change fad. I can tell from the faces in the room that a lot of you are quite young and this is probably your first change fad. You probably think that this agile fad is like the thing. It's the thing that will finally make everything better and it's never been heard before. I've been doing this for 40 years. It's completely this is my 5th change fad. It's just the same old, the messages is the same, the ideas are the same, and nothing changes. And this is because of Larman's laws, by the way. So and by the way, the agile change fad will fail as well. They all do because of Larman's laws. This is a happy night, isn't it? Yeah. Now, but back to the question, having seen this a lot, you can't convince or persuade management. By the way, Ken Schwaber, the co-founder of Scrum, has come to exactly the same conclusion. You can't. If you're in a situation where the problem is you need to sell the deep change to management, you're fucked. You're just not going to do it. You're just in a fantasy land. This is back to, you familiar with Dr. Cotter? Yeah, so as Dr. Cotter's research, Harvard Business School, one of the most famous and sort of well-researched people in the field of change. So key point, if the senior leadership are not themselves screaming for this change and themselves taking the proactive initiative to deeply understand it, you're just wasting your time. You're in a fantasy land. So for example, I think I mentioned I'm working on the BMW self-driving car. Why am I bothering? Back to Cotter, his book, Sense of Urgency, Existential Crisis. They know that if they don't get this right, they're doomed. If they don't pull off the self-driving car, they are fucked as a company. It's an existential crisis. So the board even, and I'm not exaggerating, the board of BMW has come to me and said, help, we really, really want to learn this and do it and change everything. And we'll do whatever we need to learn. And it seems to me most companies have too much money. They say they don't have too much money, but when you look at how often Larman's laws play out again and again, and when you look at the just extraordinary waste and dysfunction in organizational designs like this, which are everywhere, clearly organizations have way too much money because they get by with just massive levels of dysfunction and game playing. Does that help? Yeah, so give it up. By the way, what's the market for agile adoption in the world? It's incredibly small. In London, per year, there's maybe one little company where there's a market for an agile adoption per year, maybe. Now, the market for fake agile and fake Scrum is massive. Am I making this up? If you don't, I'm a defantasizer. If you still believe that, I suggest you just start paying more attention closely. Another February.
Okay, so do you think that dysfunction is predominantly for large-scale organizations? So as you mentioned, one of the organizations that you tackled before was JP Morgan.
Yeah.
So would you say it's conventional only for banks and larger big business as opposed to startups and small to medium?
Absolutely. Your implied question is quite right. It is true only of large scale. And in fact, Larman's fifth law, culture follows structure, it's the exact opposite in startups. In startups, it's structure follows culture. If you get 7 recent PhDs in AI graduating from Oxford, and they form a little business in Cambridge to do whatever, you can bet that the lightweight and informal organizational design and structures will reflect their mindset and their values. And has anyone here ever worked in a startup, a little startup? Yeah. Did you go from it being a little startup to like over 100 people? Do you remember the day when you were walking down the hall and you had the first time of seeing someone whose name you didn't know and you didn't recognize? Do you remember the day when the company hired the HR manager and then you got an email from them saying, "Hi, we're getting big enough now that we need some more structure, and we've decided that you need a job category." And then it starts. And then it flips from structure follows culture to culture follows structure. Okay? And I think have we exhausted February? We're on to March. March, babies? Question holders of March? Hi.
Hi. So you're talking about this like it's a big machine and there's all these kind of useless parts in there, but these are real people, right? So you do this reorganization of the teams, and there's people who don't have teams to be in. Kind of, how do you deal with that? They're real people. They're being left behind.
Right. One of the things we really emphasize in LeSS, which is we take a lot of inspiration from Toyota, is called respect for people. And so one of the principles in LeSS related to this is called, officially, job safety, but not role safety. And when I start working with a senior management group, this is one of the first points that we bring up. And whenever I'm working in change, we always will introduce a communication plan. And one of the very first bullet points in the communication plan, and one of the talking points, will be job safety, but not role safety. For the number one Machiavellian pragmatic reason of that if we introduce fear into the organization, the change simply won't work. So it has a pragmatic motivation. But it also, to Bus and me, has a respect for people motivation. These are good people. If you're familiar with systems thinking, and LeSS comes very strongly from systems thinking, the 11th law of systems thinking is there is no blame. And the meaning of this law is that the behavior of people in organizational systems is largely an outcome of the system. It's back to actually to culture follows structure. It's not like, typically all of these groups of managers, and they're often good people, smart, well-intentioned, proactive. It's not their fault that we're improving the system so that those positions aren't needed anymore. And so it's horribly unfair if they were to lose their job or their salary as a result of that. So therefore, in a LeSS adoption, job safety and salary safety are required. To go a little bit farther, this is communicated to everybody. To go a little bit farther, LeSS adoptions are done very, very soft and gently to build on this. One of the principles of LeSS adoptions is volunteering, so that in the 50-person group that's going to participate in a LeSS adoption, The only people are there are the people who volunteer to be there. And if there are some people that wanted to remain in traditional positions, we'll find somewhere else in the organization to remain in a traditional position so that no one's a prisoner of the change. And third, even before we do a LeSS adoption, the approach that I recommend is what's called informed consent, where all of the 50 people spend several months doing deep education, slow learning, spending 3 or 4 days in a workshop with someone like me and deeply grasping the implications, and then them slowly deciding to make the change rather than it being top-down. So it's both top-down and bottom-up and based upon volunteering. And then this might also lead to job retraining, which means that the senior management that remains in a senior management position needs to instigate serious job retaining mechanisms as well. It's the best that we can do. Is that a follow-up question or a March question? Okay, please. Yeah.
Okay. Bearing that in mind, that sounds quite, but bearing that in mind, if you've got senior management who, for the reasons that you kind of said earlier, want this done yesterday, speed, what kind of conversation do you open up with them to kind of start to introduce this softly, safe approach?
I never do. The answer is the same as with our other colleague. You can't sell, convince, or persuade meaningful change. It's a complete waste of time.
So with bearing that in mind,
yeah.
Because we all probably want to try and stay gainfully employed as well.
Yeah.
What for you, you've obviously got millions of different options there. How did you start to influence change then in the first instance when you weren't? I
don't. So to branch slightly, I've made my living as a programmer.
Okay.
And Bas Voda, the co-creator of LeSS, is just an awesome programmer, and he also makes money as a programmer. I recommend that nobody be an agile coach or a management consultant before the age of 50. And I mean that seriously. I recommend that everyone under the age of 50 have a real job as a scientist, a computer scientist, a software developer, an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer. Make your money doing real work. Because if you were to be a management consultant or an agile coach before then, where you're having to make your money, then I've observed over the last 40 years that the so-called change agents distort the information in order to not offend and therefore keep jobs in the fake changes. And this just creates this endless cycle of fake change and so forth.
I appreciate your honesty.
Yeah.
I also appreciate that you're probably over 50 now.
Oh yeah, way over. And so I mean this quite seriously. Give it up. Get a real job as an engineer or scientist, and stop enabling all of this fake change.
The bar is open.
And then become a change agent or a management consultant after 50 when you're financially independent, and then you can just speak plainly and truthfully with those who are interested. And I'm not talking about speaking like an asshole or being disrespectful, but I just mean putting it plain, putting it straight.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for answering.
Yeah. March babies. April. Yes, April, please.
So for the organisations that you've worked with that have adopted LeSS in some small or large scale, when you come back to them a number of years later or a year later or whatever time horizon,
right,
have they maintained the ideas of LeSS or have they regressed to something that they looked like before?
Right. Let me share with you Larman's Law 37. There's a set of them which are private and aren't public. Any real, deep, true, and successful change will be completely dismantled within 5 years or less. And I'm not joking. I'm not making these things up or meaning to be jocular. And if you don't believe that, I suggest you start paying attention. Now, the reason why is a little bit interesting here, because it's really likely that within 5 years or less, the senior manager who deeply learned and led that change will move on. And then the other person comes in and they go, because they're infected with local optimization cognitive bias, hey, where's the project managers? Where's the efficient component teams? Where's the UX designers? Where's the architecture group? And so forth. So as a consequence, by the way, I know this is a real fun and upbeat presentation I'm sharing with you, but I just have no interest in selling. I have no interest at all. You want to make a lot of money, do the following. Create a change fad that's relatively medium-sized and meaty so that when people buy it, they feel like they're getting something for their money. It can't just be a small amount of things. 2, attach to it all the latest jargon fad words. 3, promote it as providing every optimizing goal that people can think of. 4, make it clear to all of the status quo specialists and managers that they're going to be able to remain in their jobs and the status quo is safe. And 5, say that it will radically improve everything. If you package a change fad like that, you will make massive amounts of money. So you know how to make a lot of money, but that's just not my interest. I have no interest in selling anything. And so if you want to know the truth, most real changes are dismantled in 5 years or less. Now, there are rare exceptions, Toyota being one, where deeply into the DNA, deep change and radical change is part of the culture, but that's so rare. Most organizations, my recommendation for almost every place is don't give up the fantasy of any meaningful change. Stop this agile fad nonsense. Stop this fake Scrum adoption. Just get a better build system and improve your automated tests and hire better programmers. You're just fooling yourself with anything else. Okay? On that cheery note, we're on to May, I believe. Or was there another April? April, please. Yeah.
So taking a more optimistic approach, you've suggested having teams with true cross-functionality and true depth.
Cross-component and cross-functional.
Yeah, cross-component, cross-functional, and real depth in the different functions. One of the challenges to having real depth, as I see it, is that it's a constant need to keep up to date. So, for example, to be a good Java developer, to be a good Oracle developer in your example, to be a good systems administrator, is a constant need to keep up to date, to improve in that realm, which in itself can be a full-time job. How do you approach the need to maintain that skill?
I've been working as a paid programmer for 40 years, and I'm pretty good at JavaScript, Java, COBOL, APL, Unix, C. I could go on for half an hour and really demonstrate quite a depth of these in practice. And I'm just a perfectly normal person, in terms of my intelligence level and everything. The thing is simply, is that the career path is to remain as a hands-on worker. The problem is that people don't spend 40 years honing their craft. The typical career path is, okay, you're a hands-on worker for 10, 15 years, and then you enter overhead. So what I suggest instead is establish a culture of a company like in a hospital. Imagine you're a brain surgeon, and you're at this party, and we're having drinks later on, and someone asks you, what do you do? And you look like 40 years old, and you say to the other person, well, I'm a brain surgeon. And the other person looks at you and says, wow, you're still a brain surgeon at 40? How come you haven't become a hospital manager yet? You know, clearly your career path has failed. We have to change, and it's back to culture follows structure, we have to change the organizational policies around career path so that everything signals, we're going to give you massive amounts of money to be a programmer until you retire at 67. And if you do that, number one, and number two, the career path, like in the JP Morgan product developer case, is a lot more money of 3 skills, a lot more money of 7 skills, then I guarantee you, if you focus on that over 40 years, you can actually become pretty darn good. It's time for our end of discussion bad joke. Let me see. Oh, we'll end with a simple one because we're just talking about programming. A programmer walks into a bar and goes up to the bartender and orders a triple shot of whiskey, looking really happy. And the bartender says, hey, how come you're so happy? And the programmer says, oh, we've just had our first baby, and so I'm celebrating. Oh, how nice, said the bartender. So, is it a boy or a girl? And the programmer thinks, true. Thank you for your time.